This fic was commissioned by Nate, the name on the screen, can't say your last name. If you would like a fanfiction commission or a comic dub commission, check the description below and there will be a link to the doc. Yeah, so go there and listen to this beautiful fic. Boop! Twilight Sparkle, princess of friendship and one-time bearer of the element of magic, sighed in quiet satisfaction as she closed the large, musty-smelling book she just finished reading. The tome was a treatise on hypothetical subthematic particles and the proposed properties thereof. The author was proposing that these particles were responsible for semi-random effects that sometimes cropped up when a mage cast the same spell multiple times and received vaguely different results. It was utter nonsense, of course. Minor variations in casting procedure or the environment were more likely the cause of those effects without having to invent an entirely new set of highly speculative hypothetical particles to explain things. Still, it had been an interesting read, particularly the proposed aether foam that the writer had gone on about at a considerable length, and which, supposedly, attributed for the 10 to 12% energy loss of a spell cast without an inscribed spell circle. Twilight's mind was racing, and her quill sped along the paper in order to keep up. She quickly detailed several experiments that, if they failed, would lend some weight towards disproving the various hypotheses detailed in the book. She stopped mid-sentence as a thought struck her. Most of her equipment was still in bits and pieces, buried under the remains of the old library. She had ordered replacements, but these things take time, and even though her monthly stipend had increased considerably now that she was an actual princess of Equestria, a fact that still managed to take her by surprise, she currently only had enough to pay for less than half the equipment she'd lost. She thought of visiting Tartarus with the sole purpose of repeatedly poking Tarek with an extremely pointy stick, floated through her mind for a brief, but very satisfying moment. Still, even without the equipment she needed, she could at least get started on planning her experiments, which was all sorts of fun in and of itself. It was well past midnight by the time Twilight decided to turn in. She used to have an alarm of sorts that warned her when she was staying up too late, but these days, Spike had his own bedroom and no longer nagged her about getting to bed on time. She was now able to study and experiment as late as she wanted in exchange for a lack of proper sleep habits.
Maybe I should buy a clock,
Twilight thought as she yawned her way down the hallway towards her bedroom.
A nice big grandfather clock to keep in my study.
She liked the regular ticking of a clock. The predictability of it could be very soothing. She made a note to look into the cost after she woke up the next day. As she made her way towards the bed, she noticed that her horn was itching once again. It had done this quite often these days, though mostly at night. Twilight thought about it as she slid between the covers of her large princessy bed. Horns aren't supposed to itch. Ache? Sure, but itching was something else. If this kept up, she'd probably have to see a doctor.
Can horns get fungal infections?
Twilight wondered sleepily, caught between scientific curiosity and horrified nausea at the thought. Thankfully, there was such a thing as the cool side of the pillow. Twilight flipped her pillow over and snuggled down into it, relishing the soothing chill as the fabric wrapped around her horn. After a few more adjustments, mostly dealing with getting her wings comfortable, Twilight started to slip off into sleep, visions of future experiments dancing through her head. Thoughts fragmented and her mind began drifting. Her body relaxed, readying her for what she could only hope was a long, refreshing night of... Twilight's eyes shut open as she came instantly awake. Her ears twitched, trying to catch some hint of whatever it was that had woken her up. A quick audit of her surroundings showed that she was all alone in her bedroom. The sound, though it had seemed to be coming from somewhere very close, could have been outside the castle or in another room. When no further sounds occurred after several minutes, Twilight dismissed the noise and settled back in, flipping her pillow in order to rest her head on the ever-elusive cool side. Once again, her eyelids drooped, her body began to settle, and her breathing became deeper, more regular. She was falling back asleep. When that blasted noise, sounding like a cross between a flute and a diseased kazoo, once again roused her from her near-slumbering state.
Is some pony there?
Twilight asked, sitting up in her bed with an annoyed expression on her face. There was no answer. Twilight levered herself out of bed with an irritable grumble, lighting her horn even before her hooves hit the floor. The violet light chased away all but the deepest shadows, and still there was no pony to be seen. With a sigh, Twilight magicked up a small flame for her lantern. The Tree of Harmony hadn't wired her fancy brand new crystalline palace for electricity, and adjusted the wick. Several more sparks lit the other candles and lanterns around the room. With her bedroom as well lit as it could possibly be, Twilight did another scan, even going as so far as to check her closet. When that search came up empty, Twilight scooched down and poked her head under the bed. The only thing she found were several books that she was in the process of reading and had stashed down there for easy access, and a plate with the remains of a very stale Daisy sandwich that had been a late-night snack a few nights back. Twilight shouted as she jerked back involuntarily, smacking the back of her head on the bottom of the bed frame. Muttering darkly to herself, she pulled her head back from under the bed, rubbing the growing lump with a hoof. That time, the noise had sounded like it had come from the top of the bed, and it definitely wasn't her imagination.
All right,
she said to the room at large.
Very funny. You got me. You can come out now.
She waited. After a few seconds, she started tapping her hoof impatiently.
I said come out,
Twilight said. She looked around. She couldn't see any pony in the room, but obviously there was someone playing a joke on her. She considered the likely suspects. Spike was out. He liked jokes, but he tended to be more direct and, in any case, wasn't capable of this. Discord was a definite possibility, though not a probability, as his pranks tended to be a lot messier than simply making noises. That left only one likely suspect.
Come on out, Pinky,
she said, trying not to let her strained patience show. A long, silent moment passed.
I'm not mad. It was kind of a funny joke.
Another long moment of silence, and Twilight started to doubt herself.
I have cake?
She offered uncertainly. Pinkie Pie completely failed to materialize. That cast her hypothesis in serious doubt. Pinkie Pie would have come out by now, since she always owned up to her pranks. She considered them incomplete until she did so. Also, the odds of her not wanting cake were so low as to not be worth considering. And so, Twilight found herself standing silently in the middle of her bedroom, chewing on her lower lip, trying to figure out exactly where that sound could be coming from. Because of this, when the sound happened again, there wasn't much to distract Twilight from pinpointing exactly where it was coming from. Twilight jumped at the sudden sound. Her eyes slowly lifted to her horn, making her go cross-eyed in the process.
What the hey?
She asked, disbelief coloring her voice. Twilight was at her desk in the study when Spike came downstairs. The small dragon stopped at the sight of her, his jaw dropping as his eyes took in the scene before him.
Rough night?
He ventured to guess.
Wow! How could you tell?
Twilight asked with her snark in full bloom.
Well, there's the bloodshot eyes, the twitching eyelid, the snarled mane and tail.
Spike,
Twilight said with clear warning in her voice.
The empty pot of coffee on the desk next to you, and the way your back leg is jittering like it always does when you have too much caffeine and not enough sleep.
Spike!
Not to mention the sarcasm, which you only break out these days when you're really stressed out. Oh, and the pillow tied around the top of your head with twine is a dead giveaway.
Twilight's cheeks colored as her eyes flicked up. She had been hoping to muffle the noise from her horn, but it hadn't worked.
Yeah, I forgot about that,
she mumbled.
So, you want breakfast, or...?
Twilight groaned and lowered her head to her desk as Spike stared. He pointed a claw at her.
Did your horn just...
Yes,
Twilight said.
Okay.
Spike waited for an explanation. None came.
Why?
Twilight's head came up and she glared at him.
I have no idea. I've been looking all night, too. Unfortunately, I don't have that many books on magical illnesses now. Stupid chair blew up most of the ones I used to have.
Spike winced. That was still very much a sore spot with the former librarian. Twilight might be soft-hearted, but Tyrek had lost any possible chance at a Discord-style redemption once he blew up the majority of her books.
So what, that's been going on all night?
Spike asked.
No wonder you couldn't sleep.
Yeah.
Twilight rested her chin on her forelegs and sighed.
I've spent all night looking through every medical book I still have and nothing has come up. I thought I'd find something in magical musical maladies, but nope, nothing! Though, I did discover a way to stop the involuntarily spontaneous musical numbers that keep happening in Ponyville.
Aw, but I like those!
Yeah, they grow on you.
Twilight's fond smile was short-lived, as her horn let out another... A look of utter despair settled over her face, and she lowered her head back to her forelegs.
Oh, Spike, I just don't know what to do!
Why not do what you always do when you run out of ideas?
Spike suggested. Twilight gave him a puzzled look.
What's that?
This is quite a puzzle, it's true.
Zecora sighed and leaned away.
But I am afraid that I have found nothing physically wrong with you.
Nothing wrong?
Twilight replied, incredulous.
There's obviously something wrong.
Yes, your horn is making music, and yet I can find no way in which you are sick.
Zecora hummed and tapped her hoof against her chin.
Were there any symptoms you might have had before these noises got so bad?
Well, my horn has been itching periodically over the last few days.
Twilight blushed, really hoping that it wouldn't turn out that she had some odd magical fungal infection in her horn.
To think of it, it hasn't itched since last night.
Itching should not take place in your horn. Is it not made of pure alicorn?
Twilight knew that Zecora was talking about the bone-like substance that comprised the horn of a unicorn rather than a wing-horned pony. It was a confusing thing, having the word alicorn apply to both, but Twilight's letters to various academic circles with proposals to rename one or the other was always shot down.
Mostly true,
Twilight replied.
There are blood vessels and nerve endings wound through it though, so I can feel heat, cold, pressure, and apparently itching.
Zecora leaned forward and examined Twilight's horn once again.
I see no sign of distress. I am at a loss, I must confess.
Twilight sighed and rubbed her forehead with her hoof. She stood up and did her best to smile at her zebra friend.
Well, alright. I'm sorry to have bothered you for nothing. Ah! I hate this!
Twilight stomped a hoof on Zecora's floor.
I'd at least be able to deal with it a little better if I at least knew why this is happening.
You may think more clearly with a little sleep.
Zecora said as she rummaged through a shelf full of potions. She produced a jar made of red clay and stoppered with a wax-covered cork.
This potion here for you to keep. Take a sip or two before you lay down for the night, and I promise, noise or not, you will be out like a light.
Twilight's lavender aura took the pot from Zecora's hoof and floated it into her waiting saddlebag.
You're right. I am pretty tired.
Twilight smiled wearily.
Thank you, Zecora.
Zecora put a hoof on Twilight's shoulder and pulled her into a hug.
Sleep well, my friend, and never fear. Curse it all! That was right in my ear!
It was called by many names. Some called it the Palace of Harmony, others called it Castle Twilight. A growing number of ponies called it the Castle of Friendship. Most ponies in Ponyville, however, called it the Huge Eyesore. Twilight angled her way towards the balcony outside of her bedroom. To fly properly, one had to balance speed and power, and Twilight was not having too great success with either of those. This was, in large part, thanks to some uninvited company she picked up on her way back from the Everfree Forest. She quickly adjusted her path as said company, once again, dive-bombed her head.
Get away from me, you crazy goose!
The Princess of Friendship shouted as she flapped awkwardly to avoid getting hit. The goose honked angrily, and Twilight's horn did its thing again, which only served to infuriate the bird even further. It looped around, an elegant flash of white in the sky, barely missing Twilight's head. Twilight didn't so much land on the balcony as she did crash. She hurried through the glass door and closed it, just as the goose landed outside. The goose, which had been an epitome of grace while in the air, instantly transformed into a large, goofy-looking bag of feathered hate once it folded its wings. It glared at Twilight through the glass, watching her every move with its fury-filled, beady black eyes.
Note to self.
Twilight muttered.
Ask Fluttershy what tweework means in goose language.
She levitated out Zecora's sleeping remedy from her saddlebag and placed it on her nightstand table. However, there was one thing she needed to do before she slept. She needed to eat. It was well past lunchtime, and she had skipped breakfast and lunch, while also flying to Zecora's hut and back. Her stomach felt achingly hollow. She tried to ignore the noise her horn was making, and she walked down the hallway. Unfortunately, the large and mostly empty castle acted as a large echo chamber, bouncing the noise back at her from every angle. Whatever substance this palace was made of, it reflected sound quite effectively. The upside was that Spike heard her coming. He was waiting in the kitchen with a large cucumber and lettuce sandwich, a glass of milk, and a guilty expression. Twilight eyed the first two hungrily, and the last one warily.
Promise you won't be mad,
Spike said, which was never a good phrase to start out a conversation. He was shuffling his feet and fidgeting with his claws, too.
After the day I've had, Spike, I really can't promise that.
Twilight said with a sigh.
I made you a sandwich, though,
He said with a hopeful tone in his voice.
Yes, I see that.
Twilight replied. She heaved another sigh and sat down.
What is it, Spike?
He cleared his throat.
Well, you see, I was worried about you, so I did what I always do when I worry about you.
In other words, you panicked a little bit.
Twilight picked up the sandwich with her magic and took a bite. It was pretty good,
Yeah,
he replied, nodding eagerly.
So what did you do, Spike?
He hesitated, then said in a breathless rush.
I wrote a letter to Princess Celestia about what's going on, and please don't be mad because I was just worried!
Twilight blinked.
Oh,
You're not mad?
Spike asked, hope lighting in his eyes.
too tired and too hungry to be mad, I guess.
Twilight said with a shrug.
I'll just finish off this sandwich.
You might want to hurry it up,
Spike suggested.
Why is that?
because Princess Celestia already wrote back. She wants you in Canterlot as soon as you can get there.
Twilight sighed and brought her forehoof up to meet her forehead.
Of course she does.
You couldn't walk through Canterlot Castle without tripping over royal guards. They patrolled every hallway and stood guard at the most important junctures and doors. To reach the throne room, for example, you have to pass 3 different portals, each with no less than 2 guards standing ready, with another full 16 guards on standby within range of a quick shout should there be any trouble. The same was true for the doorway to Princess Celestia's chambers. Her guards stood stoically against any and all uninvited guests. If you weren't on the princess's appointment list, you weren't getting in. Which is why Twilight marveled at how strange it was that no pony thought to guard Celestia's balcony. After all, this was a land where roughly 1/3 of the population were Pegasi, and yet pretty much any pony could simply land there, open the glass-fronted windows leading to her study, and walk right in. Twilight, being the polite pony she was, knocked first. The door opened with Celestia's signature golden glow. As she trotted in, Twilight let slip a small smile. Her mentor already had tea set up, the ancient porcelain teapot steaming and releasing a spicy, peppery smell. Luna was there as well, sitting next to her sister and getting crumbs down the front of her chest as she nibbled on a scone.
Princess Celestia, Princess Luna.
Twilight said as she approached.
Princess Twilight.
Celestia said gravely, and Twilight immediately knew her mistake.
Sorry, Celestia.
Twilight cleared her throat.
Luna, you're both looking well.
As are you, Twilight.
Celestia said with a pleased smile.
How was the trip out here?
Oh, it was all right.
Twilight said, then grimaced.
I had to shake an evil goose on the way up here, though.
Luna brayed with a laugh, spraying crumbs of the scone across the table, much to Celestia's obvious annoyance.
Your modern euphemisms are quite amusing.
Twilight exchanged a confused look with Celestia.
It wasn't a euphemism. I really was being chased by an evil goose.
Ah! Luna winked.
No worries, your secret is safe with me.
Twilight was at a complete loss as to what Luna might think shake an evil goose might mean. Her brain, always eager to please, started conjuring up a series of increasingly disturbing images that might fit until Twilight forced it to stop.
Right. Anyway, you wanted to see me, Princess?
Celestia cleared her throat, and Twilight blushed.
I mean, you wanted to see me, Celestia?
Celestia nodded and smiled warmly, her eyes twinkling. Luna had already returned to eating her scones with a single-minded dedication. It was a scene that warmed Twilight's heart, a reminder that she was considered an equal now, no matter how much she felt like she hadn't earned it. It was nearly a perfect moment. Which is why, of course, her horn chose that exact moment to make everything embarrassing and awkward for her. Twilight groaned and hid her flushing face behind a hoof. Which was too bad, because if she had been looking at the sisters, she would have seen them sharing a knowing look.
Well,
Celestia said, a proud smile spreading across her face.
our little Twilight is growing up.
Luna nodded somberly.
Indeed.
Twilight's eyes snapped up, looking back and forth between the two of them.
What? You know what this is, Celestia?
Indeed I do.
Celestia replied, her voice as placid as a lake.
Please sit down. Tea?
I don't...
Twilight considered her options.
Sure, why not?
Celestia poured her a cup, and Luna begrudgingly passed over the plate of scones. Twilight levitated one to her mouth and took a bite.
Blueberry,
she thought as she munched. The sandwich back in Ponyville hadn't been enough to fill her up, not after skipping breakfast. A second scone quickly followed the first, Luna watching them go with an expression that conveyed a sense of deep loss.
It's something that eventually happens to every alicorn,
Celestia said. Then she hesitated, considering.
Well, nearly every alicorn.
But what is it, Celestia?
Twilight asked.
I couldn't find any reference to it in any book I checked.
Admitting that books had failed her had caused an almost physical twinge of pain. Celestia, though, just chuckled and sipped her tea.
You wouldn't have, of course. It's not something that we are, well, very eager to spread about.
Celestia brushed delicately, like a sunrise.
It's a little embarrassing after all.
Indeed,
Luna said.
Most vexing. So, this has happened to both of you?
Yes, Twilight,
Celestia said.
And now you will learn one of the greatest secrets of alicorn kind.
Ooh!
Twilight leaned forward eagerly, ignoring the tea and scones, the latter of which were deftly fetched back by Luna's magic. Celestia took on a tone of voice that Twilight was so used to, and had missed so much since she first moved to Ponyville. The voice of the mentor teaching her student.
You see, Twilight, alicorns have a much greater magical potential than unicorns, pegasi, or earth ponies. This potential gathers in us and it leaves, well, a residue for a lack of better term. No matter how much and how quickly we use our magic, this buildup will accrue, rather like how scales will build up in a teapot.
Ugh,
Twilight shuddered.
that doesn't sound healthy.
Well, if it were allowed to continue indefinitely, then it would be.
Celestia replied.
The residue gathers in our horns, which is the most potent conductor of magical energy in our bodies. It begins with a horn itch.
I've had that!
Twilight blurted. Then she covered her mouth with her forehooves, mortified at having interrupted her teacher.
That infernal itching,
Luna muttered, twitching an eyelid.
Yes,
Celestia said with a shudder of her own.
Fortunately, that passes quickly. The residue then removes itself from the body. Why it does that by making loud, obnoxious noises is Isn't Pony's guess. I've never been able to find out why.
Twilight's horn decided that this would be the prime opportunity for a demonstration. once again letting out its now familiar
Yes, exactly like that.
Celestia said, clapping her forehoofs together. Twilight felt oddly proud and embarrassed at the same time.
Okay, I guess that makes sense.
Twilight considered that for a moment.
Well, not really, but
She shook her head.
never mind that. How do I stop it?
Celestia sighed.
You can't stop the buildup of residue, and you can't keep it bottled up inside, or it will eventually cause an aether blockage that can lead to illness or even complete magical burnout.
Twilight shuddered at the thought.
No,
Celestia continued.
you can't stop the release from happening. However, you can redirect it.
How?
Twilight asked desperately.
Please, Celestia, I need sleep, and I can't get it with all this noise.
Celestia smiled gently.
How do you like my mane?
Twilight blinked, confused at the sudden non sequitur.
It's very pretty. I've always admired.
It suddenly clicked in Twilight's head.
No.
She gasped, unbelieving. Celestia smiled and nodded.
You mean you can redirect the magical residue buildup to go into your mane and tail instead of through your horn?
Ah, alas, Luna said mournfully. She got it right away. I now owe you 10 bits, sister. Celestia shot a glare Luna's way. Twilight, meanwhile, was glowing with the knowledge that Celestia had bet on her being able to figure it out.
Yes,
Celestia said.
it's a very simple process. I can show you how it works if you'd like.
Oh, yes, please!
Twilight said eagerly. In the back of her mind, she was doing a little dance. Not only would she learn new magic, but she'd get an ethereal flowing mane and Rarity would be so jealous. She tried to pretend she hadn't had that last thought and focused instead on the learning of new magic.
But wait, though.
Twilight said.
What about Cadence?
What do you mean?
Celestia asked, exchanging a look with Luna.
Well, she's been an alicorn longer than me, and her mane isn't all wavy. And the last I checked, her horn doesn't make music.
Well,
Celestia looked away, obviously uncomfortable.
you see, there's
She trailed off, cleared her throat, and started again.
different ponies mature at different rates, after all. And Cadence, while she is certainly as strong, or stronger than the average unicorn, well,
She gave Luna a desperate glance. Luna stared back expressionless.
compared to other alicorns, Cadence is... How do I put this nicely?
She's a snubhorn, Luna said bluntly. Twilight stared blankly, not having any idea of what Luna meant. Her confusion wasn't helped at all when Celestia gasped and rounded at her sister. Luna! Celestia said, scandalized. What? Luna drew her head back and folded down her ears. 'Tis true, is it not? Compared to other alicorns, Cadence is a snub.
We don't use that word anymore.
Luna pouted. Why not?
It's not polite.
Celestia said.
It's actually considered extremely offensive, and has been for the last 3 centuries.
Why? Luna asked, her brows knitting. It is a perfectly good term to describe magically deficient. Celestia winced. At this time, Twilight joined her.
We don't use that term either,
The elder sister said. Preposterous! Luna declared. How will you rank ponies in magical prowess if you don't have any way to tell who's inferior?
We don't do that anymore,
Celestia said. That's ridiculous!
You weren't there for the protests.
Celestia said with a shudder.
Trust me, it's better this way. Quieter, at least.
Luna looked away and crossed her forelegs over her chest with a disaffected humph. An awkward silence descended, broken when Celestia cleared her throat once again.
In any case, I will cancel the spell on my mane and tail in order to walk you through it, Twilight.
Her horn glowed golden, and her mane suddenly went limp.
We have to hurry. The buildup will happen quite rapidly, and I don't wish to have my own horn go off. Please, Twilight, stand.
Twilight stood quickly, her wings flexing in eagerness as she followed her mentor to the center of the study, where there was a bit more room. Celestia had an urgent look on her face, her mouth strained and her eyes narrowed.
Are you all right?
Twilight asked.
The itching has returned, Celestia said shortly. No matter, Twilight. Attend closely.
Twilight watched as Celestia performed the magical ritual that would redirect the buildup away from her horn and into her mane. Celestia talked slowly and evenly as she did so, explaining all the different ways she was weaving the threads of magic together. During the lecture, Twilight couldn't help but notice the increasing twitching of Celestia's ear and the occasional thrashing of her tail. When Princess Celestia started pawing at the ground with her forehoof, Twilight couldn't restrain herself any further.
Is everything okay, Princess?
She asked. Celestia grunted irritably, a sound Twilight had never heard from her before.
Yes, I'm fine. Don't distract me, please. The infernal itching is doing that quite well enough on its own.
Celestia must have noticed the downcast expression on Twilight's face, because she smiled and said more gently,
And it's not Princess anymore, remember?
Yes, Celestia,
Twilight said meekly.
Thank you, Twilight,
Celestia said with a warm, if somewhat twitchy smile.
Now, as I was saying, you tie this off here and...
Oh?
Twilight repeated, tilting her head.
Oh, dear, I think...
Princess Celestia's eyes widened.
I can't... Cover your ears, every pony!
What?
Twilight asked.
I don't...
The noise that came from Celestia's horn was like a foghorn on steroids, which Twilight experienced more as an enormous sense of pressure rather than a mere sound. The room shook, glass broke, and small objects tumbled from the shelves and bounced across the floor. Twilight, meanwhile, was wondering if it was possible to teleport without using magic, because she certainly didn't remember diving underneath Celestia's couch, and yet here she was, surrounded by dust bunnies and wondering vaguely if the palace cleaning staff ever cleaned under here, and who she would talk to make certain that they did. Luna had managed to cover her ears in time, both with her hooves and with a noise-dampening spell that she had ready to cast since the lesson had begun. After the sound faded and Twilight's hearing began to return, she became aware of the Night Princess was laughing outrageously, holding her sides and lying on the floor as her hind legs kicked and her wings fluttered helplessly. Wide-eyed guards burst into the room a moment later. At first, it was only the door guards, but others soon followed. Soon the room was crowded with guards, all of them twitchy, all of them armed, and all of them looking for trouble. One of them was using a spear to prod at a potted plant, as if he expected assassins to spring from the soil. Celestia, standing in the middle of a now devastated study with a mortified look on her face, raised her hoof to her mouth and coughed, immediately getting the attention of every pony in the room.
Pardon,
the Princess of the Sun said sheepishly. It was a normal day in Ponyville. The Pegasi had scheduled a short rain shower in a little over an hour, just to cool down the summer heat a little and to provide some much-needed moisture to the gardens and flower beds of the town's residents. 2 ponies, one taller than the other, stood on the balcony of the Castle of Friendship, pretending to watch the weather team begin to assemble the layer of clouds needed for the rainfall.
So that's different,
the taller of the ponies said. Twilight made a non-committal noise in the back of her throat, not meeting the other mare's eyes.
Don't get me wrong, it's very pretty. I like the way it moves. The little starbursts are nice too.
Thanks, Twilight muttered, even though she wasn't really all that fond of it herself. Ethereal manes weren't all that cracked up to be. Sure, they sounded cool and all, but it made her scalp feel like it was crawling, and her mane would occasionally flow the wrong way, obscure Twilight's vision, or get into her food. Celestia assured she would get used to the first, and the second would eventually stop as her mane and tail began to train themselves to flow in proper directions. And if Rarity had been jealous at all, she hid it well, showing only enthusiasm and joy for Twilight's sparkly new princess hair. This caused Twilight both mild annoyance and a great deal of shame at feeling annoyed in the first place.
I like how it seems to glow. I mean, the highlights are always a stunning contrast to the darker parts of your mane, but now the pink and magenta really stand out.
Thanks, Twilight muttered again, not knowing what else to say. Her wings twitched on her back, as if wanting to spread away so she could fly.
I only have one question, though,
Princess Cadence said, and Twilight felt her nerves rack up another notch.
Yes?
How come your meme started doing that and mine hasn't? Twilight's very soul cringed at the question. The last thing she wanted to do was hurt Cadence's feelings, but no explanation she could think of would stop that from happening. After a few moments of frantic thought, she latched onto something Celestia had said.
Well, you see,
She said carefully.
different ponies mature at different rates. You know.
Cadence's head drew back, then her eyes narrowed. You know I'm 10 years older than you, right? When Twilight only blushed and looked away. Cadence huffed irritably. Fine, don't tell me then. The pair stood in awkward silence on the balcony. Twilight was trying to think of something to say when she noticed Cadence's raising of a hoof to her horn out of the corner of her eye. She watched as her sister-in-law rubbed her horn while scowling.
Cadence?
Yes, Twilight, Cadence replied, a little snappily.
Does your horn itch?
Yeah, just a bit, Cadence admitted. It started a couple of days ago. Why? Twilight loved information. The feeling of knowing something that other ponies didn't was wonderful, and was topped only by being able to share that knowledge with others who needed it. There was nothing quite like the feeling of being a mare with all the answers. Still, after what she'd been through to learn about this particular bit of alicorn biology, Twilight decided to play up the delivery a little bit. She drew herself up to her full height and gave Cadence a Celestia-inspired look of serenity and confidence.
Well, Cadence, there are many mysteries regarding being an alicorn. What I've recently discovered is...
Twilight was interrupted by a faint noise, like a brass whistle being played a long distance away. It made a sound like this. Cadence gaped, staring cross-eyed up at her horn. What the hell was that? Twilight's carefully composed expression of serenity shattered and she collapsed, laughing next to her bewildered sister-in-law. The pair stood in awkward silence on the balcony. Twilight was trying to think of something to say when she noticed Cadence raising a hoof to her horn out of the corner of her eye. She watched as her sister-in-law rubbed her horn while scowling.
Cadence?
Yes, Twilight? Cadence replied, a little snappily.
Does your horn itch?
Yeah, just a bit, Cadence admitted. It started a couple of days ago. Why? Twilight smiled a small secret smile.
Oh, no reason. Just let me know if you hear any strange noises, okay?
Cadence gave her a sidelong glance. Okay, I guess. The days passed and the itching of Princess Cadence's horn only increased. Eventually she was given a prescription medication in order to treat a flare-up of an extremely rare horn fungus. The pair stood in awkward silence on the balcony. Twilight was trying to think of something to say when she noticed Cadence raising a hoof to her horn out of the corner of her eye. She watched as her sister-in-law rubbed at her horn while scowling.
Cadence?
Yes, Twilight, Cadence replied, a little snappily.
Does your horn itch?
Yeah, just a bit, Cadence admitted. It started a couple of days ago. Why? Twilight smiled a small secret smile.
Well, maybe it means you're growing up.
Cadence frowned, giving her a sidelong glance. 10 years older, remember? Twilight nodded and grinned.
True. Maybe it's just horn fungus then.
Cadence stared, cross-eyed up at her horn in horror. There's such a thing as horn fungus? Twilight just started laughing. Cadence grumbled as she followed her husband back to the royal bedchambers. Shining, bless his stalwart heart, had done everything he could, but nothing seemed to offer relief. The problem was Cadence's horn was itching and it wouldn't stop. It wasn't severe, it was just annoyingly persistent. The only thing that helped so far was plunging the entire length of it in a bucket of ice water, even if it had her personal physician baffled.
Honey?
Shining's voice was hesitant. What? Cadence asked.
You're rubbing your horn against the bedpost again.
Cadence stopped, uttering a few curse words under her breath as she did so. It doesn't help anyway, she muttered darkly. If she could have figured out a way to sleep with her horn in a bucket of ice, she would have been overjoyed.
Well,
Shining Armor said as he slid between the sheets.
I may know one way to distract you from that itch.
Cadence hesitated at the edge of her bed.
Really? How?
Shining grinned and waggled his eyebrows at her in what he probably assumed was a sexy and inviting way. Cadence clenched her jaw and reminded herself that she was a princess of love, and as such, it would probably be a bad thing if she jabbed her husband over and over again with her horn until he stopped being an idiot.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Cadence said, ignoring his disappointed pout as she slid into bed as well. Her horn flared, turning off the lights in the bedroom. Shining still popped up, facing her, waited a few seconds before letting out a sigh and rolling over.
All right. Good night, hon. I love you.
In spite of the last few days of irritation, Cadence still managed to smile.
Love you too, Shiny Bear.
The royal couple settled down to sleep, Shining's gentle snores starting up a few minutes later. Cadence tossed and turned, as she had every other night since the itching had started. Her eyelids had finally started to go heavy, and sleep was finally laying claim to her, when a tiny little noise woke her up. On the plus side, her horn finally stopped itching. On the minus side, the noise from her horn not only kept her awake, but it woke up her husband as well. Between the infrequent tooting and Shining Armor's childish giggling, Cadence got absolutely no sleep at all.